Hello and welcome to ARC, a forum for open discussion. Unfortunately, Ben cannot be here today. However, I'm joined by a trio of guests. These are, of course, Joe Taylor, pharmacy student at the University of Bath, Tom Hawkins, economics student at the University of Bath, and currently on placement at AXA Investment Managers, and Tom Marsden, a politics student at the University of Bath, who runs the Brexit Help Desk at the London Chamber of Commerce and Industry. My name is Ellis Wiles, politics student at Bath and currently on placement at finance firm BDO. And today we will be discussing who is the greatest post-war Prime Minister of all time. There have been 14 Prime Ministers since the Second World War, navigating Britain through a plethora of earth-shaking events such as the Cold War, decolonisation and the rise of a global economic system. These Prime Ministers have helped shape the country for better and for worse, and have led us to where we are today. We have identified 4 Prime Ministers who constantly top the internet and television polls as the best Prime Ministers of all time, and have had the biggest impact on British society. So unfortunately, Anthony Eden has just missed the cut. The 4 Prime Ministers we have chosen are Clement Attlee, Harold Macmillan, Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair. This is not the only thing we will be discussing today, with a quick look at this week's news stories also being covered. However, first, as always, we'll look at an interesting fact each of us has learnt this week. So Joe Taylor, I think we have to start with you after your mind-blowing fact last week about spiders taking over the world. It made me think, why are we worried about Brexit or Russia when the real threat is the spiders who are planning their assault right now as we speak? What is your fact today, mate?
I have a slightly more focused fact on my degree, and I found out today that in GP surgeries there are these new ECG machines, and when you go to a hospital or something, you have to get an ECG done, and it takes a long time. It's 20 minutes on this big ass machine. Now there's this little device. It's about the size of the palm of your hand. It's 2 little pads. And what you do is you hold the 2 index fingers of each hand on these pads for 30 seconds, and it does an ECG on you, and it sends it to your phone, and that can identify if you've got atrial fibrillation or anything. It's not entirely accurate, but it's a really good device for screening. And they said that if you screen, how many did they screen? I think it was 100,000 or something. And if you can eliminate the possibility of 6 or 7 people having strokes, a stroke, and recovery costs the NHS about £100,000. So that's how much you're saving. And one of these devices costs £100.
Blimey.
It's pretty impressive, isn't it? My mind was actually blown by that.
All right, well, Tom Marsden, what is your interesting fact?
Mine's very different to that. Apparently, when Neil Armstrong came back from the moon, he used to tell really unfunny jokes about the moon and then say to people, "Oh, I guess you had to be there."
Well, I thought Armstrong never went to the moon, Tom. I thought it's a massive conspiracy.
When he went to the film studio, yeah, sorry. He'd say, "Oh, I guess you had to be there," and I wasn't.
You have to be in Arizona.
All right, Tom, what is your interesting fact?
So my interesting point for this week was that last Friday, the Fed yield converted. So what this means was that the interest rates that you would get on a bond for a 3-year bond was lower than the interest rate you would get on a 3-month bond. Now, typically, you get paid a higher interest rate on longer rated bonds because you've got more risks just generally because there's longer until the payout of the bond. So what this tends to show, this only happens very often, once every while. It happened 10 years ago, just before the start of the 2007-2008 financial crisis, and it's generally seen as a precursor to economic recessions. So it's not all bad news in the economic data, but that was definitely something to keep an eye on, and perhaps we will be seeing a recession in the next couple of years.
So that wouldn't be ideal, on top of Brexit as well. My interesting fact is I'm a Tottenham fan, as you guys all know, and our club has been getting a lot of stick about not winning trophies. So I thought I'd look up who's won the most trophies in England. The top of the list is Man United with 66, and Tottenham, considering we're known for not winning trophies, are the 5th most successful club in terms of trophies.
So you're not even in the top 4 then.
Well, we're 5th.
If you were Prime Minister to be debated, you wouldn't be debated on this podcast.
Anywho, I thought I'd look at your club.
You won the Autoglass Trophy, Alice.
Oh, that's a huge one.
Won it 2 times.
Wow.
How many times have you won the Intertoto Cup?
The AIA trophy is coming home, boys. That is a big one. Newcastle.
You've already jibbed the no draws.
Yeah, you bottled that as well. Newcastle are 9th with 14 major trophies. And I thought I'd look up Stoke, but they are so far down, I lost count. They've won one major English trophy, along with
the 1972 League Cup.
Yeah, and John, you're in real good company with Clapham Rovers, Royal Engineers, and Reading. Actually,
Hey,
Wait, what did Reading win?
proper football clubs.
God knows. I'm surprised they've won a trophy. To be fair,
What did Newcastle win?
That doesn't
I know the
matter.
league in like 1902 or something.
you won the league 4 times.
Yeah, but when was the last time? 1920.
So I just thought there was another stat here. Teletubbies have had the same amount of number 1 singles as Stoke have won major trophies. Have you any thoughts on that, Tom?
Proper football club with proper history, pal. Second oldest in the football league.
Yes.
You've had all that time and you've still not won anything good.
As I said, we've won the Auto Glass Trophy 2 times, and you can never take that away from us.
Yeah, I guess fair enough.
How many World Cup winning goalkeepers have Spurs have?
Exactly.
Or Hugo Lloris for a start.
That is true. English goalkeeper.
Hey, it only counts if they're English. Come on.
Yeah,
Oh yeah, I forgot that one.
Can we quote you on that, Tom?
This is going live, Tom, to our massive following of 16 Twitter followers. Right, so now let's take a look at the week's news. I think firstly we have to look at Donald Trump, who must have had a great Sunday night with Robert Mueller clearing him of any collusion with Russia. The Mueller investigation came in 2 parts. Firstly, the question on whether there had been collusion with his campaign and the Russians. On that, there is 100% exoneration, with Mueller finding that his campaign did not conspire or coordinate with Russia. There was also the obstruction of justice question, which threw up more ambiguity. Mueller declared that while the report does not conclude the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him. This has been looked at by the Attorney General and William Barr, who have concluded that the evidence developed during the special counsel's investigation is not sufficient to establish that the president committed an obstruction of justice offence. So what do we think about this issue then, lads?
Well, I think really, if you look at when they set up the special counsel investigations, when they set up the rules for that, the whole point was that there was someone who was apolitical to make these difficult calls. So now he's come in, supposed to be apolitical, and jibbed the call on obstruction of justice and left it to the Attorney General, who was appointed by Trump. Obviously, Bill Barr went in his hearings with, or in a memo that he wrote that famously went public before he was nominated for the Attorney General, he made the argument that there was a very, very high level that needed to be breached to indict the president, and made specific arguments about obstruction of justice. So I think the Democrats will definitely be pushing as hard as they can to see as much of the report as they possibly can. Even if they don't indict him, they'll probably hope that at least enough damaging stuff comes out that they can damage him in the polls. I mean, if you look at the amount of people around him that have confessed to other crimes or stuff that's come out that hasn't come out to do with Russia, but other damaging material, I think they'll just use this as an excuse to press for more and more of the information.
Yeah. I think also it's important to note that Mueller didn't exonerate him of collusion with Russia and the Trump campaign of collusion with Russia. What the report says is that they did not establish that there was collusion, which means that there wasn't admissible evidence. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't in some way collusion. What they're saying is that they need to wait to the full report before you can conclusively say he's exonerated. And that it's premature to say he's been exonerated of anything.
But you have to admit, the general public aren't going to look really much into this. All they're going to hear is the headline stories. So do you reckon it will affect Trump that much in the polls?
I think it just gives him a lot to tweet about, honestly. And he already has been.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, Trump said he's going to release it, but they're going to redact it first.
Okay. Do you think the Democrats need to move on from this tactic? And they've already made a bit of a start.
Yeah.
The House Majority Whip James Clyburn said Tuesday's special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation represents a closed chapter, while healthcare is the new chapter.
Yeah.
So they're already moving on to actual issues.
Yeah, I think they've been banking on this for far too long. It should have just been a thing that they had up their sleeve, but they've kind of been pressing for it as their main thing for a while now.
Yeah. Well, if you look at it for a lot of the time, I think, especially when they got the majority in the House, people like Nancy Pelosi kind of realised this shouldn't be our main talking point. We need to,
Yeah,
but we can't push this too hard. And I think the leadership, at least, kind of respect that. So I think that they definitely will use this, pull back on it a little.
I'm just worried about the late night show people. What's James Corden going to say?
oh, I know.
He hasn't got any material now.
What's Trevor Noah going to say?
Well, he's always got something to say. So.
He's always got something to say.
But yeah, so there we go. I guess that's Trump in the clear, really, in that respect. As in, there is other lawsuits against him, obviously, but they're thin bricks.
It's in the clear for that one topic.
Yeah. Right, well, another huge news story from this week, well, a huge story for the last 3 years, is Brexit. As of recording, last night's MPs put forward a series of options to take Brexit forward, including leaving without a deal, creating a customs union, and backing a confirmatory referendum on any deal. But after several hours of debate, none of the 8 options emerged as a frontrunner among MPs. Theresa May is also still desperately trying to get her deal across the line, yesterday declaring that she'll resign if her deal passes. This has ironically led to around 25 Conservatives coming round to her deal, including big hitters like Boris Johnson. However, the DUP still refuse to back it. Breaking news in the last 2 hours or so suggests that there will be a Commons vote on withdrawal agreement tomorrow in a fresh bid to break the Brexit deadlock. As it stands, we'll leave the EU on the 22nd of May if the government's deal passes. If it does not, we'll leave with no deal on the 12th of April, unless there is a significant change of direction. What do you guys think of last night's votes, and where do we go from here?
I think last night's vote was kind of inevitable, really. There's a lot of, all these options put out, and with the way that voting's been going recently, it was kind of inevitable that no one's going to come to any sort of agreement.
Yeah, I don't think it's groundbreaking at all. I think we've all known for a long time there's no consensus in the House for any one type.
Although I do think it is important to notice that customs union got quite a lot of traction, so it only lost by 8 votes, and it is still short of a majority because the 8 votes is just that they would have it in that way. But 60 MPs did abstain as well on that. But 8 votes is quite close to possibly something that you could get consensus for in the future, especially if they vote on it on Monday with fewer options.
The fact that a confirmatory referendum on any deal got a decent amount of support is interesting as well. I was not expecting that level of support. Although I suppose Labour did whip for it, so
yeah,
it would have been an embarrassment if they'd got a significant amount less votes than they did.
Yeah, a lot of these things didn't lose as badly as May's deal.
Yeah, well, Theresa May's deal was regarded by many in the polls as being a pretty bad deal. As many as 66% of Leave supporters now believe that the UK is faced with a bad deal, even more than the 64% of Remainers who expressed this view. So there's a big, big amount of people who just are not supporting that deal at all. Obviously, it's an impossible job because you're going to upset some people. However, it's clearly unpopular with the public.
Yeah, I think it's important to note, though, that, one, her deal won't pass tomorrow because without DUP support, she'd need a lot of Labour support and also all of her Tories. And her saying she'll resign was only meant to get her own party on side. It actually alienated a lot of Labour. So the Labour rebels were like, well, I don't want potentially to have a hard Brexiteer leading the negotiations, or have Boris leading negotiations.
Well, so Boris is second favourite now with Paddy Power, behind Michael Gove.
They don't want anyone else, really. So they're saying, well, her stepping down is also not going to make us back her deal. So she's lost some of the Labour support she had. The DUP have said they won't support it. So really, all she's done is weaken her own position by saying she'll resign.
There's a few big hits that have come round, though. Like, there is a lot of the ERG who are going to back her deal because they don't want a customs union. That's a lot closer than May's deal would be. And I think the hope of a no deal was wiped out by those votes, and that was one of the big losers of last night.
Yeah, I think one issue with that, though, is the fact that May's deal doesn't exclude a customs union. So May's deal is just the withdrawal. You could then lead into a customs union. So if majority for a customs union and a second referendum in theory, and also they were to approve May's deal somehow next week, that would mean that you'd use May's deal to get to a customs union, provided that a second referendum confirmed that was the option you wanted. So these things aren't mutually exclusive.
And a customs union would solve the Irish border, so then you wouldn't get into backstop territory.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't have a difference of rules between Northern Ireland and the UK, so you wouldn't have issues with the DUP.
I think the Revoke Article 50 movement is, well, I don't think there's much grounding behind it, in the sense that at present the average level of support is Remain 54%, Leave 46%. I thought it'd be a lot bigger than that, considering what I heard. It's still pretty close.
Yeah.
Even polls on the People's Vote depend how it's being asked. For instance, polls suggest an average of supporters for a second referendum, when it's described as a People's Vote, is 12 points in favour of a referendum. However, the average level of support and opposition changes when people are asked if there should be another referendum, with Remain as an option on the ballot paper. And asked in this way, opponents outnumber supporters by 9 points. So it shows that people want a choice on the deal. They just don't want Remain to be on the ballot paper, it seems.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
But what about that tasty 6 million signatures for a second referendum, bro?
But no, that was just to revoke Article 50.
That was it, sorry.
That wasn't even to vote on it. It was just to revoke
Yeah,
it.
just to revoke it. That's pretty bad, isn't it? Like, stop it.
Well, you went to the march, Tom. What was it like? Did you
It was
speak to anyone there or anything?
I just saw a lot of banners and stuff. There were some good ones, like End May Before April. I enjoyed that. And
There's
then
a few Alan Partridge ones I saw as well.
Lots of Alan Partridge
loads of other
ones.
Partridge ones. Then there was like 46 million people didn't vote for this.
How many people were there, actually? It was over 1 million, apparently.
So people are also estimating 400,000 because
Yeah, BBC estimates hundreds of thousands. Obviously,
Yeah.
People's Vote are going to overplay it.
Yeah,
So,
obviously.
I wonder what's
little.
happening with this Leave march tomorrow. Is that supposed to be still there?
Did you see the footage of the start of it, when they kind of compared the two marches, and there was like 20 people stood in a field out in Sunderland somewhere versus like 1 million people on the streets of London? Have you seen the other ones where Nigel Farage is there like giving a speech, and then these people are driving a bus with a big screen on the side of it round as he's giving his speech, and it'd be like footage of him going out and campaigning for this US senator who's like been convicted of like sexual assault or something.
That's quite good. Yeah, I reckon tomorrow though, the vote won't have as many people.
I think
Yeah.
she'll get more supporters. I just don't think it'll pass. But then you never know in politics, do you? Anything can happen. We may as well move on to the topic at hand then. The best post-war Prime Minister. Joe, do you want to kick us off with Attlee?
I'll give it a go. So, the completely unbiased Anthony Michael Howard, editor of the New Statesman, said that he was the greatest Prime Minister of the 20th century. Now, that is a pretty bold claim, but to his credit, Attlee does have quite a lot to say. So, just 2 achievements straight off the bat. He was the longest serving Labour leader, and he had the largest ever swing achieved by a party at a general election, which was 12%, which was pretty impressive. He had quite a few reforms. So Attlee had a pretty tough job, like Britain's just come out of a war, pretty massive war. A lot of people obviously have been killed. The economy is in absolute ruins. It never really massively recovered after the Depression anyway. So he's got a lot on his plate. So 1947 Agriculture Act, more generous subsidy for farmers. 1947 Transport Act. He does a lot to improve the rural economy. And as a result of his initiatives, there was a 20% increase in output between 1947 and 52, with Britain having one of the most modern and efficient farming industries of the period. Then one of his big passions was education. He increased spending on education from 6.5 billion to 10 billion during his tenure, which is, massive. 920, just primary schools, 928 new primary schools were built between 1945 and 50. Obviously, the massive one with Clement Attlee is nationalisation. So you've got the Bank of England was nationalised in 1948, as well as civil aviation. By 1951, 20% of the economy was in public ownership. Biggest thing, thanks to Nye Bevan, is the NHS in 1948. And he had a number of workers' reforms, which involved higher wages and reduced hours for workers. Then there's the economy, which unemployment during his tenure rarely rose above 2%. Between 1945 and 51, 1 million new homes were built. The number of cars on the road rose from 3 million to 5 million between 1945 and 51. The economy grew 3% per year between 1946 and 51, and things like the Monopolies and Restrictive Practices Act allowed just that, investigations into monopolies. However, he did have some, let's say, shortfalls. Biggest one probably being the independence of India. Now, he was very interested in giving India independence. Clement Attlee had this kind of view: is he was an imperialist. He did support the idea of a British Empire, but in a similar kind of, like, in a mirror to Churchill, I guess, in a way, he saw it as a force for good and for bringing up the colonies, their societies, to kind of Britain's standard, I guess. But the way he thought about it was like a more socialistic view. He thought he wanted the workers and such in places like India to have more rights. He wanted better social security in these places.
Yeah.
And so while, I do respect his ideals in that way. So he became, during the war, I think it was it just before the war? Sorry. 1928. Yeah. He became a member of the Simon Commission, which was essentially a commission on investigating and trying to implement independence in India and Pakistan. So he was on that between 1928 and 1934. And he was essentially the Labour Party's expert on India by 1934. So he implemented that in 1947 in what was seen as a very, very quick implementation, and it was absolutely catastrophic. The way that Britain pulled out and just partitioned India, like places like Punjab and Kashmir and all that, these places were completely split, and loads of, like, millions of people were resettled, and it ended up with this partition that between 500,000 and 1 million people were killed in the violence ensuing.
Terrible.
It was a horrendous affair. However, his decolonization of places like Burma and Sri Lanka was a lot more peaceful, a lot more successful. Another black spot is the Korean War. Now, I do respect Attlee's stance. He used to be very, not pro-Soviet, but he wanted good relations. He kind of favored early in his leadership. He favored this kind of third way between the Soviet Union and America. He wanted Britain and Europe to form.
He wanted them to be in the middle, didn't he?
Yeah, this third power that kind of acts as like a buffer and a mediator between these two powers. Obviously, because of the sheer economic trouncing that the whole of Europe had taken, this was impossible. And with the implementation of things like the Marshall Plan, they just completely abandoned this idea and decided to stick with America. But early on, when he's still trying to kind of keep trade relations with the Soviet Union alive, because he wants to trade Britain out of its kind of financial situation, he sells, I think it's 25 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines to the Soviet Union under the pretense that they will only be used for commercial aircraft. And the Soviets say, yeah, don't worry, we'll do that. They instantly reverse engineer them because the Soviet jet aircraft was absolutely terrible at this point. They take the potential best jet engine in the world, sell it to the Russians. The Soviets then reverse engineer it and stick it in this plane called the MiG-15, which was on par with the American F-82 Sabre. And like the Americans used to like themselves when they saw it because it was very capable fighter craft, and that was using the Korean War against us, really, which we went into because he, towards the end of his leadership, he did see the Soviet Union as a genuine threat. He at first didn't feel it was a threat. He didn't think that they wanted to take over the world, but his fellow ministers convinced him that they are a massive threat to national security. So he went into the Korean War, which ended up with 1,078 British servicemen being killed, 2,674 being wounded, and 1,060 either going missing or being taken prisoner. Now, I think that's the largest loss of life in a war zone for Britain since the Second World War.
Only 5 years prior as well.
Only 5 years prior, yeah. Exactly.
So living standards rose 10% each year. The economy grew by 3% each year. and the UK had the best economic performance in Europe. So why did Attlee not get re-elected more? Why didn't he increase his majority? Or
Yeah, so it's essentially by the time that he came to by 1950, the government was pretty much exhausted. Like a lot of its senior ministers were old, and there was a lack of new ideas.
Yeah.
And when it came to 1950, he got a massively reduced majority, and essentially with austerity, there was quite a big deal of austerity. You know, there was still rationing going on, and so the middle class stopped voting for him. They started voting for the Conservatives, and so therefore he gets a much smaller majority, and he can't effectively govern.
There may be a case of too much too soon. I think a big point about Attlee that is not mentioned a lot. People think, oh, he's the NHS man. His educational reforms were huge. He increased the age of school leaving to 15.
To 15, yeah.
And university scholarship were given out to the poorest people. So he really tried to stop that divide. He also has a really weird point on the EEC, which was after his premiership. He was not a fan of European integration. He said that if Britain was a member, EEC rules will prevent the British government from planning the economy, and Britain's traditional policy has been to look outward rather than continental. So I think that's a really weird point, considering most of the left these days are very in favour of, remaining in the EU.
I think it depends how far left you look. If you look at Corbyn, he's a Eurosceptic, whereas, like, your centre left, you're slightly left leaning the centre. Yeah, I agree. But you've got further left leaning people who, where the EU's anti-industry or anti-monopoly kind of stuff, their rules would stop them fully implementing their ideas, then you do have opposition to the EU.
Yeah, no, I guess there is quite a lot of rules in the EU. His leadership style also is a good point. It was very, very different to what we see today, as in, by all accounts, the cabinet aren't massive fans of Theresa May currently, are they? But his leadership style was he led as a chairman. And Christopher Soames, the British ambassador to France during the Conservative government of Heath, and cabinet minister under Thatcher, who I bet was very, very different, remarked that Mrs. Thatcher was not really running a team. Every time you have a prime minister who wants to make all the decisions, it mainly leads to bad results. Attlee didn't. That's why he was so damn good.
Mm. He was very good at bridging divides in his party, and that was one of the reasons he failed. It was a massive internal difference came when there was an austerity budget in 1951, and Nye Bevan resigned because they wanted to implement charges for teeth and spectacles in the NHS, while Hugh Gaskell was just like, no, we need this, and it kind of led to a big divide in the party, which Attlee just couldn't bridge.
Well, Gaskell took the party more to the right, as in.
Yeah, he did. He was very centre.
Yeah, changed Labour forever, really. I think Attlee's one of those prime ministers that he's appreciated more after his premiership, like a lot of years after, more so than it was actually at the time. For instance, in 2004, he was voted the most successful British prime minister of the 20th century by a poll of academics, as in he was unlucky with his election because I think he won the most vote, just first past the post screwed him up, really. Well, moving on from Attlee, we have Harold Macmillan. Tom Marsden, you've done quite a lot of work on him. What was he like? What made him so great?
So Harold Macmillan isn't one of these prime ministers that everyone talks about as a huge revolutionary. Like the other people, well, two of the other people in this, you've got very revolutionary figures. So Attlee, the creation of the welfare state to a great extent, and then Thatcher, sort of the changing of our economy. Whereas with Macmillan, he was incredibly important internationally because a lot of decolonization happened under him, as his famous Winds of Change speech delivered in Ghana and South Africa shows. He recognized that the world was changing and he wanted Britain to change with it. He was also hugely important in reconciling the relationship with America. So after the Suez Crisis, where our relationship had been very, very badly affected by the fact that America imposed sanctions on us and essentially told us that we couldn't do what we were doing and then literally made us stop doing it. He then reconciled that relationship due to his personal friendship with Eisenhower. So that was very important. And he was very important there then as well in being a mediator between the Soviets and the Americans. So he got the foundations of the nuclear test ban treaty under him. and also in getting the first sort of nuclear non-proliferation agreements sort of not in place, but sort of the groundwork for those. Domestically, he was lucky enough to be prime minister during a period of relative stability. He even said that this is the best we've had, and that is because he did have a very sensible policy. He introduced premium bonds, which were hugely successful, despite a lot of economists at the time thinking that they wouldn't be a great hit. And he was very it was robust domestically, but it's more about the other things that he did. So with America, also he did oppose the Soviets in certain ways. So in the Middle East, he sent special forces into Amman, then a Saudi and Egyptian-backed movement there, and other use of RAF and special forces to prevent Syrian attacks, and even station troops in Kuwait to prevent possible Iraqi aggression that maybe another prime minister could learn from. And he was also very important with the EU and Britain's relationship with Europe. So he recognized that we were no longer this huge power. And I think that after Suez, he was an incredibly important prime minister for coming in and realizing that Britain weren't this same power, but also realizing how we could transform. He realized that we needed to be this bridge between Europe and America. So rather than just doing a special relationship or just being a continental, he actually decided that we need to bridge this gap. So he tried to join the EEC.
Would you say that's one of his biggest failures?
It is in a way. It is in a way, because it was a failure. There's many reasons why de Gaulle vetoed him, and it was partially French interest. But he did lay the groundwork for us later to join. And it is a failure that he wasn't able to. But also another reason why he didn't was because we refused to share American nuclear secrets with the French. So that was quite important.
That's when the French were leaving NATO later on and doing all sorts of weird stuff. So yeah. I wonder why we didn't.
Exactly. Like at the time, France wasn't in a position where we wanted them to be a nuclear power. And also he also prioritized our development of a nuclear program as well. So Britain's hydrogen bomb was developed under him. And he realized that we couldn't rely on conventional forces anymore in the same way. And he recognized that it needed to change the power dynamic internationally. So he did develop our own nuclear program, which again helped reconcile the relationship with America. And on top of this, he also did create the European Free Trade Area. He was one of the founders of that. So creating again the groundwork for a relationship with Europe that wasn't necessarily tied into it fully, but recognizing that Europe as a whole needs to be more intermeshed and to work together.
Well, some people are saying that we should join back in the EFTA, aren't they?
Exactly, yeah. So, and that's a lot of conservatives, it is a conservative policy. He is a conservative prime minister, but he does have this very liberal aspect to him.
He's a one-nation conservative, isn't he?
He was, absolutely. And he created a pension system. Unemployment was incredibly low. He had 3 members of cabinet resign over some of his policies of one-nation conservatism, including Enoch Powell. Ben
Powell's uncle, yeah.
Ben Powell's uncle. He was a very important figure, and he transformed the Conservative Party. So he got them out from under the shadow of Churchill. So it was no longer Churchill's Conservative Party; it was now its own beast as well. And so I think that he was an incredibly important figure for that reason. And I didn't talk much about Africa, but if you look at the French decolonization of Africa happening at a similar time in the Algerian War, and then you look at the decolonization of Africa, which was largely non-violent at the time because of the way that he did it, and the fact that he decolonized Africa and as well the rest of the empire in a very sensible manner by doing a cost-benefit analysis. So he did this audit of empire, so he saw what parts of it cost us money, what parts of it can afford to be given independence, what parts of the empire are stable enough countries. So he looked at Tonga and saw, clearly they're more ready for independence. They were granted independence uniquely among the Pacific Islands because a lot of them weren't politically stable enough. So he didn't grant them independence in the same time because he noticed that they weren't all necessarily ready to be self-governing. But he also recognized that, contrary to a lot of conservative politicians who said that we should wait until everyone's ready, he quoted a previous politician, I can't remember who it was, from 1850, and he said, a man didn't enter the water because he was waiting until he could swim first. And it's important to notice that he did recognize that you couldn't have this paternalist sort of civilizing attitude like Attlee and a lot of previous prime ministers had, you had to recognise that these people had a right to self-government and self-rule, and I think that's why Macmillan's this incredibly important politician and prime minister figured out our relationship with empire, and I think that was incredibly important.
You must say though, his second term was not as good as his first by a long shot, really. Can you explain much about the weaknesses of his second term in office?
I think his second term in office, a lot of it is down to the fact that he himself wasn't a particularly healthy man at that stage, much like Churchill's second term, I think, or his, second come back to office. But also it was a government racked by scandals, which weren't necessarily his fault. So he had two scandals, and people said this is like the moral degradation of our politics. And I don't think either of those are necessarily his fault. And I think that was
these scandals are a pinprick on what Trump's been.
Yeah, exactly. And the government was in both circumstances exonerated, to use that term, by committees afterwards and investigations afterwards. So I do think that oftentimes second terms are less effective, but let's not forget that four African nations were decolonized during his second term.
There was a big debate about him and nepotism. I think he filled government posts with 35 old Etonians.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, he appointed one of his nephews to cabinet as well. Like he was a nepotistic politician, and his perspective was that because he was almost he married into aristocracy, and he was from a very wealthy family historically, but he had this attitude of caretaking for the lower classes in his words. So he believed that it was for the aristocracy to look after and do what's best for the whole country. And, that isn't an attitude that necessarily is good to have now, but I think at the time it was a more progressive one than other conservatives certainly had, and it was slightly less than the left had. So he was sort of a very middle ground figure in that way.
I think one of his major failures was the railway stuff. I understand his point. He wanted railways to be run as a profitable business, but this led to the notorious Beeching Acts, destroying many miles of permanent railway and severing towns from the railway network. So he sort of divided the country up in that sort of sense, which I don't think was good.
That's not really necessary. That was a terrible failure in that sense, but also I can see why he was trying to do it. It just wasn't a very effective way that he executed that policy. And I think that ultimately it doesn't detract very much from his legacy, which is so strong in other areas. I think it's a relatively unfortunate but more minor drawback, especially given it was later resolved.
Well, speaking of running things like a profitable business, I think we should move on to Tom's pick of Thatcher.
Yeah, so a conservative female prime minister who was very divisive and managed and was in charge of the country in very difficult circumstances. I don't think we'll ever see one of them again, or we might. I think the first thing to do is really set the scene before she came into office. So you have the 70s, you have stagflation, awful economy, strike,
the
winter of discontent. You have the IMF bailing the UK out. Just remember when Greek got bailed out in 2008. And try and imagine the UK being in that position. And then I think that starts to give you a bit more of a grounding towards the reasoning behind the massive reforms that she went into place. They called the UK the sick man of Europe at the time. And then if you look at where we were economically when she left office, we were a massively strong economy and we were completely revitalised. So if you take it before and afterwards, there's a massive divide between where we are as a nation. And then let's go into how she did that. So first of all, you look at nationalisation of industries. A lot of people have certain things to go to say against these policies. Not necessarily going to say that all of them were a success, but you look at British Telecom. That is the breakup of that has created an efficient industry. Same with British Airways, dividing up the airlines has created a competitive industry. Everyone moans about the railway service, but the railway before Thatcher, when it was nationalised, was completely awful. So to say that it's not improved, yes, things are expensive now, but on a wide scale, things are a lot better now than they were before. You look at when she brought in the ability for people to buy their own council homes, which brought through a massive increase in home ownership in the country. which I think was a great policy. I think it's really important that more people are able to afford their homes. You look at the boom in the City of London and the amount of more investment that was brought in. I think that was incredibly positive for the economy and gave us a worldwide competitive industry, which is something that's really important.
Well, a 2010 review by the Institute of Economic Affairs says it does seem to be the case that once competition and/or effective regulation was introduced, performance improved markedly. However, this literature is not unanimous, and there have been pros and cons to privatisation. Apparently, it's a net good.
Yeah, I think it is. I think there's certain industries that it doesn't make sense. Like you look at electricity and water, for example, they're natural monopolies. It perhaps makes more sense to run them by the government. But again, you look at the amount of mismanagement and the amount of inefficiency when the government was running these policies. There's no direct link. It's not obvious to say that if they were managed by the government, they would be better to this day. And if you look at a lot of industries, as I said, about telecoms or about airlines, things have markedly improved. So domestically on the economy, I think there are massively strong benefits of her premiership. And if you look at the culture of the UK, we went from this kind of idea that we were going backwards in the world, we were declining power, to really being a country that was moving forwards again, that was improving. This was shown in the economy, and there was a real sense of people needed to work hard and be self-serving, which perhaps you look toward 2007, 2008, you might argue decades later went too far. But I think in that time, that was arguably what we needed. And then when you look at foreign policy, you've got obviously a couple of major events. You've got the Falklands War, where America was neutral in that dispute, and you've got some UK parliamentarians or politicians saying that we should let it stand and we should let them have the Falklands. She stood by the fact that they were ours and we should have fought to defend them, and we successfully did, and that was a great thing for the nation. It inspired a lot of confidence and a lot of happiness. Secondly, you've got the relationship she had with Reagan. Again, as Tom spoke about how Macmillan started to build a good relationship with the US, Thatcher was definitely the next step in that. She built a great relationship with them. She also helped to bring Reagan to the table with Gorbachev. She met Gorbachev before Reagan ever did, and she met him, I think, before, when he was the number 2, before he was in charge, and she said, I like this man, this is a man I can do business with. When he came to power, she did a really good job in bringing Gorbachev and Reagan together, which ultimately helped come towards the end of the Cold War. You also look at other fights, like when towards the end of her premiership, when she bolstered George H.W. Bush on invading in Iraq and these other areas, where she's always had a moral sense of what was right and stuck by it. I think whether people question domestically or foreign policy wise if she was right or wrong, she definitely had a moral standpoint that was believable and you could make an argument for, and she stuck by it. So yeah, I think she was an incredibly important prime minister, and she has shaped the nation massively for the better.
I think another thing, Tom, actually, is the 1980 Iranian embassy siege. Like, that did a massive thing for her image as well, didn't it? Like, her stance then of there is absolutely no tolerance of terrorism.
Exactly.
Like, she had a lot of conviction that I have a lot of respect for.
Yeah, I think there was a point where I think people had made a couple of comments about how she was the only woman in the cabinet at one point, and she got put on education, which I don't think she particularly was very thankful for. And she said something like she wasn't just a woman politician who was there as a token. She was there for her own opinion and her own. She was there as a merit. And then when people kind of criticised her, there are many famous quotes about how stubborn she was. I think the famous one, the speech where she said, "For everyone waiting for that famous media catchphrase, the U-turn, how about U-turn, the lady's not for turning?" And these famous phrases now that transcend time, or perhaps the talk about she referred to herself as a conviction politician, not a consensus politician. Which, if you look at the times, there needed to be serious reform held. and it took someone of that ilk to really change the nation in the way that was needed.
I think there are issues with her foreign policy, though. For instance, she opposed sanctions on South Africa by the EEC and attempted to preserve trade with South Africa. Like, she invited President Botha around and called the ANC terrorists, basically. And although she did want an end to apartheid, that could have been handled better on her part, perhaps.
Yeah, definitely. Well, one thing on foreign policy that I didn't mention before, she was massively pro-Europe on trade terms, and she did a lot. There's the famous photo of her in the jumper with all the different flags of the European nations. But then later, she opposed it as a political union, and she won us rebates from Europe as well, which perhaps sets some of the anti-Europe precedent in the Conservative Party, which has led us to where we are. But I think if you look at her, really, she saw Europe as a positive for trade, but not a political union, which I think reflects most people in the UK's reflection of Europe, certainly mine to this day.
Yeah, I must say there were a few domestic issues, though. I know we've talked extensively about foreign policy, but what about the union stuff? We haven't really gone into that yet.
I think the unions, they didn't help themselves to begin with.
The unions held too much power, and if you look at the 70s, the way the economy was run for a long time was consensus between the unions and the companies and the government, which is great ideologically or theoretically, but when you get to something like you get to a place in the 70s where you've got massive unemployment but also really high inflation, and none of those three parties want to budge, then realistically the people who have to budge are the trade unions. Because if anyone else loses their power, then that's worse. So I think we were at a point where the trade unions needed to be weakened to a certain extent, at least to move forwards.
Well, I think due to stoppages and partly due to trade unions, when she came into office in 1979, more than 29 million working days have been lost, and this fell to fewer than 2 million in 1990. And to get the country up moving again in that sense. But you have to look at things like the mines. There's dozens of communities that have just been decimated by the privatisation or the shutdown of
mines. And I think that's one of the main failures of her, but also of governments after her, is while it was clear to see that those mining industries, the industrialisation that we lost, was a trend that was happening, there needed to be some kind of alternative built. You can make an economic argument, okay, like these mines aren't profitable.
A lot of mines that were shut were profitable. Like, there's no real excuse for that, I don't think, is there?
Yeah, I think that the issue with Thatcher is one of the issues that was with Attlee as well. Is that she did huge sweeping changes that were important, but too quickly. I think that they weren't done efficiently. So it's like with Attlee, she's this huge welfare state when we weren't necessarily in a position to afford it yet, because we hadn't recovered structurally and, with our infrastructure and with our economy. And I think Thatcher did the opposite. So she took this country that wasn't in a good economic state, and she took people who were already struggling in certain communities, and she said, okay, you can survive economically. I'm going to do this incredibly callously, and I'm going to do it knowing full well the repercussions. So, unemployment did increase to 18% at one stage, with, millions of people out of work. And these communities were absolutely destroyed, and they're still feeling the effects of that. Because as Tom said, there was no replacement done, but also it was done so quickly, with no real recognition of the fact that we then had this huge power vacuum or power struggle where you had London against the whole north of the country. And it's something that I think has come back to bite us as a country with this anti-establishment rhetoric that's coming up now.
She's clearly very controversial. She has the second lowest average approval rating of any post-war prime minister, and that's probably gone down since, but it was 40%. There's a lot of things like social problems with drug abuse, family breakdown, that happened due to the high unemployment rate. That's a problem that has just carried on developing. British feminists regard her as an enemy because she did little to advance the political cause of women. I think all her cabinet members were male, which isn't the best for promoting equality. Is it?
No,
Really?
I think she definitely saw it from a case of this wasn't just to women. This was on a blanket view to everyone. Very much a case of if you want to earn something, go and do it for yourself. I think she applied that to everyone in an equal manner.
She was famously more proud that she was the first prime minister with a science degree rather than the first female prime minister.
Well, speaking of the science degree, as in she did do a lot to advance climate change. Really, she was the one who put it on the agenda first.
Yeah, that is a big point actually. I think a lot of people miss that about Thatcher, don't they? Like,
I didn't
it's
know
not
it.
spoke about very much.
No, as in I didn't know it until literally I was researching for this podcast.
Especially given that, like, you know, the Conservative Party is traditionally seen as, you know, the one that cares least about climate change, especially in the 80s as well.
Well, yeah, there was the Environmental Protection Act of 1990. She set up the Hadley Centre for Climate Change Research and Prediction, the establishment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the ratification of the Montreal Protocol, which was crucial in preserving the ozone. She got it in the mainstream, and I think that's a real big, well, it's a good thing. It's a real good thing. Yeah, and you wouldn't expect it from someone as hardline as Thatcher, as in someone who suggested the use of chemical weapons in Iraq.
Maybe that's why she closed the mines. She didn't like coal.
Yeah. Right, so I guess it's my turn. I'm probably going for arguably the most controversial figure in Tony Blair, as in, I saw a YouGov poll recently, which is 17% of people had a positive view of Tony Blair.
But that's because it's fresh in the memory, isn't it?
Yeah, I
Definitely-
suppose. But
definitely
I think Iraq gets in the way of a lot of his premiership.
You think?
Well, he did a lot of good things. He did.
I thought it was about ID cards.
It was definitely the ID card.
Oh, yeah.
It caused the global financial crisis.
We've got David Cameron's message there. Yeah, but I'll run it through, for instance, economy, social, and international. So we'll start with the economy. Obviously, this was primarily Gordon Brown. However, Blair let Brown do it. So whatever economically happened good was under his government. So 1.4 million people in the UK are now making a tenable living wage as a result of the living wage legislation that was brought in. And the UK economy performed really well, with the real incomes of Britons growing by 18% between 1997 and 2006. And there was a significant reduction in relative poverty, unemployment dropped, and the UK grew at an annual rate of 2.4% during the 10 years Blair was in office, compared with 2.1% on average during the previous half century. And it was higher than the Eurozone average, so Britain really was booming. Central bank independence was another important policy of his, and it's widely seen to have ushered in stable UK growth and relatively low inflation. And this was mainly due to investment in the economy, funded partially by tax, as in taxation increased from 39.3% share of GDP in 1997 to 42.4% in 2006. And yeah, that was used on public services. The NHS spending rose by 39.9% of GDP to 48.1% of GDP at the end of Brown's premiership, and this was mainly decided after 2001, as in there was a big spending boom there, because they promised to keep the spending low during the first 2 years of his government. Obviously, there were loads of economic issues. For instance, debt rose, the PFI contracts were a ridiculous policy, and they were literally due to Brown's political manoeuvring, as he just wanted to look good and keep spending off the government table. And apparently, yeah, PFI provided schools and hospitals worth 43 billion, a long-term cost to the taxpayers at 150 billion.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah. And there's obviously, I don't know why PFI isn't talked about as much as the gold, because he sold gold at a 20-year low, but the PFIs were terrible. I guess it was still investment in the economy though, so that's one benefit. The social policies there, where Blair really, they're the things that he took a great interest in and he thrived on. For instance, civil partnerships, the Welsh Assembly, Scottish Parliament, the Mayor of London, plunging crime rate, Human Rights Act, removal of hereditary peers in the House of Lords. And yeah,
I mean, Scottish Parliament's an interesting one. I mean, like Holyrood. That's building of Holyrood's an interesting one, isn't it? What they were How much of a budget were they?
Yeah, they were over budget, but it's something that needed to be done. As in,
It definitely was, but it was just a bit of a disaster.
Weird point is, Blair thought devolution would actually decrease the demand for Scottish independence. That's one of the reasons why he was in favour of it.
That's an interesting one as well.
It didn't work out like that.
Really?
Well, the referendum result was actually stay in the UK, so, Blair's policy worked in that sense.
What we'll do, we'll take these nationalists, these people who want to leave us, give them a institution and a platform to base all their views off. So then they can say, do all this like massive censorship data and have a really big name like the Scottish Parliament, and that will just then add weight to their argument, and then we'll expect nationalism to die down.
Well, don't forget, Labour were the main powers in Scotland at this time. Labour won the first, two Scottish Parliament elections. So they just thought it'd be a nice little Labour thing where Labour runs Scotland and it doesn't really matter. Obviously, the rise of the SNP due to the...
Now it's just SNP runs Scotland and it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, Labour can't win an election nationally if they don't have Scotland, so...
Well, Scotland, apparently the Conservatives are doing quite well in Scotland under Ruth Davidson. She's really galvanised them and led them from a position of nowhere to actually being somewhere. More about Blair. He promoted equality in law, both for women, for instance, he extended rights to paternity, maternity, and adoption leave and pay. And unlike Macmillan with his old Etonians, he promoted equality in the cabinet. For instance, there were more women than ever in Blair's cabinet up to that point, and there was the Blair's babes craze with the increase in female parliamentarians. Blair was very popular with the LGBT community, with the Civil Partnerships Act, while discrimination in the workplace and in relation to the provision of goods and services were made illegal. And his approval ratings were really, really high to start off with. After the Diana incident, they soared to heights of 93%, which shows he was very popular at certain points. Also, in that 2002, Who's the Greatest Briton of All Time, Blair was very high up. I think he was top 20. So in 2002, he was regarded very, very strongly. All sort of changed in 2003. I wonder why. But even abroad, I know Blair gets a bad rap for his intervention in Iraq, and rightly so.
He gets a bad rap for those war crimes.
Yeah, as in Iraq was a disaster. However, he did have a lot of successes internationally, and his brand of liberal interventionism worked in a number of cases, for instance in Sierra Leone and Kosovo. He is currently a hero to Kosovan Albanians, many of whom have named their children Tony Blair.
That's amazing.
So they're called Tony Blair, whatever their surname is, which is a weird one. There was also peace in Northern Ireland that was brokered in the build-up to the Good Friday Agreement, which was obviously crucial in bringing peace there. It's a shame Brexit's going to...
I don't think you have to do that.
And yeah, in Kosovo, the threat of a ground offensive convinced Milosevic to withdraw. Blair was the main advocate of this proposed ground offensive, while the limited Operation Palliser, I think it's called, in Sierra Leone, swiftly swung the tide against the rebel forces. And before Blair's deployment of these troops, the UN mission had been on the verge of collapse. So he really sort of helped improve things over there. And I think his successes in Kosovo, his success in Sierra Leone, was a primary reason for his intervention in Iraq, because he thought he could spread this liberal ideology around the world, because it worked so well in those two cases. With the Iraq issue as well, I think it's underplayed currently how bad Saddam Hussein was. For instance, Trump's come out and started basically not supporting, but he said Saddam, there was stability in the region under Saddam.
Well, Saddam was an authoritarian ruler, so of course Trump admired him. If there's anything we've learned, it's if you can do whatever you want and the press doesn't question you, then Trump thinks that you're a great leader.
Well, yeah, but he did kill 1 million of his own people, Saddam Hussein, and who knows what would have happened if Iraq hadn't been invaded. Perhaps that field of rose. So I think getting rid of Saddam Hussein wasn't the worst idea in the world.
That's a really
I think I think it's just the lie that it was built on. Like, oh, he has WMDs, and then we go in and we're like, okay, so where's these nukes? And Blair's like, haha, there weren't any.
Well, there was that thing. The
still
foreign
here.
CIA operative recently said that they genuinely did think with the intelligence they had that they did have nuclear weapons.
Yeah, but like CIA intelligence is like an interesting one, isn't it? They were like, oh, you know what? We can make LSD a mind control drug, and look what happened there.
I'm pretty sure the investigative commission afterwards concluded that they knew beforehand that they didn't have WMDs. When they investigated it, they said, yeah, quite clearly they had the information to doubt this guy. Because there was one guy who said they had WMDs. And they were like, let's believe him and then commit all these troops. And like,
it's like Andrew Wakefield.
For civil law in the UK, but not international law. That's much less important, apparently.
Well, many people in the Labour Party were very, very against the invasion of Iraq. I think 179 people Labour MPs rebelled against it, which is outrageous, really. It's outrageous that 179 people voted against him and he still managed to get it passed. That just shows how good his majority was in that sense. There's also this tendency in recent years to blame, why are there issues with the Middle East? It's due to American foreign policy or British foreign policy. But I don't think it can be put down to that solely. There are many other factors that led to this. Even William Hague has admitted this, saying that the growth of sectarianism in the Middle East, rivalry between different states in the Middle East, the rise of religious intolerance were not necessarily provoked or subdued by Western intervention. And that's a conservative saying that. So it just shows that it's not all down to Iraq. It's not all down to the war on terror.
Yeah, I think that the crucial thing with comparing all of these great figures is what did the country look like before and what did the country look like afterwards?
Mm.
And then Blair's inherited a relatively stable country who were doing relatively well economically. He then took us into a war that no one supported, cost a lot of lives, and then at the end of it, I don't think you could in any way blame him for the financial crisis, but
blame Thatcher more probably.
But some of the decisions he did make were questionable. Like he did try and take us into the euro just before the financial crisis. Like he was like, "This is a great."
I think the fact that he bowed down to Brown on that, and again, it's similar with the Thatcher stuff. Under his government, we didn't join the euro. Ultimately, whether he wanted it or not, he ended up siding with Gordon Brown and not taking a stand on that issue, which it is important to note. There definitely is economically, Labour didn't help themselves in the sense that we should have run budget surpluses, paying off national debt, and shaping our economy making our economy stronger for the future. But realistically, it was a global financial crash. Everyone around the world was affected by it. Many countries worse than us.
Yeah.
And it was actually the austerity policies afterwards that led to us almost having it worse than other countries.
The austerity policies that needed to be put in place because of his own budget or his own not wanting to run a budget surplus.
The country,
if we'd gone into that with a lot more sound finances, we wouldn't have needed to cut spending in the same way.
But other countries had worse finances, as Krugman says. They had worse finances than us. They didn't pursue austerity, and they got out of their recession quicker.
Yeah, I don't think you can blame Blair for the financial crisis.
No, you can't. I'm not saying you should have seen it coming, but realistically, if you go through those good times that he did and didn't provide for the next generation or for the future and be as sensible economically as he should have been. Yeah. But that's easy to say in hindsight.
I think he was a good politician, but I think he didn't, at the end of his tenure,
what's the lasting effect?
What is the big key difference that the country was in afterwards? If you take away the financial crisis, what's the key, country that he's left us with? It's not that.
He left us with a better country, for sure.
But only in minor ways. I don't think that there was a particularly important change that was underwent through Blair.
Well, I think the Human Rights Act is pretty important. I think the fact that the economy, there was a plunging crime rate, the funding of the NHS, trust in the NHS was never really higher than under Blair. Even the things such as for the LGBT community, to the Civil Partnerships Act. This has been superseded. And I think the main thing, you forget David Cameron was going around calling himself the heir to Blair. That's how much of a huge figure Blair was. He saw 4 Tory leaders. He got a standing ovation and applauded off in his last House of Commons session. So to say that he didn't have a big impact on the country is, I think, a bit naive.
I think he was well liked, but I don't think he will have had a revolutionary change. And I think part of that, like perhaps part of the reason that he's had no resolute or massive change in the economy was that it wasn't required.
Yeah.
And we lived in good times.
I know we're in good times. Why did our economy grow faster than the Eurozone then? He must have done something right in that respect.
He was the right prime minister for that time.
He was good. Don't get me wrong, but it's hard to say greatest of all times when he lived. He was in a good time and he did a good job versus he was in troubling times and did a good job.
He did an exceptional job, I think, of managing the country in a good way where we only really improved in a lot of ways, and he did a very good job of that. But I think when it comes to a lot of these, who was the greatest prime minister, it has to be the crises they faced, and the only crisis he faced, he caused. So I think that does detract. Like his biggest crisis was the Iraq war that he went into. So I think that.
I thought you were going to say the global financial crisis then.
No, he didn't cause that. Brown caused that.
Brown stole all the gold.
I think a major thing about Blair is the Olympic bid, which is always nice to stick it to France, isn't it?
Very important. That's very important.
Actually, I agree. It's the best.
Because I think there is an Irish IOC member who was like, if Blair wasn't there, the Olympics would have gone to Paris. And this came after the Paris president was slating our cuisine and having a major go at us. And Beckham, Prince William, and Tony Blair somehow managed to get it over the line.
What a trio! What a trio that is.
It's arguably better than you three.
Yeah, arguably.
Pushing it, isn't it? And that also, the Olympics is crucial because it stopped us going into another recession.
Actually, the Olympics is really important.
Pretty well timed. It's pretty quality to have the Olympics then. What a great year as well, Jubilee as well.
Oh, 2012, it's one of the best years of all time.
Olympics is brilliant.
The country was actually united. Everyone was enjoying themselves. The weather was good.
Just like now.
Well, the weather's going to get better with climate change, so.
We're supposed to have a heat wave next month, apparently.
Really nice winter. It's had a really nice hot winter.
It has, actually.
I'm ready for Beast from the East Part 2, Electric Boogaloo.
There's going to be a lot of floods. There'll be a nice, keep the newsreaders busy.
It's March, and it's meant to be 18 degrees and sunny in London tomorrow, so.
It's slightly worrying. It's obviously good, but it is slightly concerning.
I would blame Thatcher, because she didn't close the mines quickly or
Thoughts on people who say that if you didn't have Thatcher, you wouldn't be able to have a Tony Blair? I think there's a famous question where someone asked Thatcher, what one of the best things she gave to the UK was, and she said Tony Blair. Do you think there's any weight to that?
I think it's unfair. I think Blair put a lot more public funding in than Thatcher did. As I said, he increased funding for the NHS massively. He also, unlike Thatcher, unemployment went down under him. So I do think that's a bit harsh. One of his major things was inequality didn't really go down under him. And that's what a lot of leftists have against him. For instance, when Mandelson said, we are intensely relaxed about people getting filthy rich.
But I think if you want to talk about inequality, under Thatcher, the top 10% went from having pre-tax or post-tax revenue of 5 times to 10 times the bottom 10% from the start to the end of her premiership. So I think inequality-wise, Thatcher is massively blown.
With Thatcher. So I play the trombone. I play it in like a lot of brass bands, and there's this one,
Weird flex, but okay.
Yeah, weird flex. So it's the one that I play in. It's a lot of it's made up of a family, and one of the guys, he was like, so he lived through Thatcher, and as a miner, and he said there used to be 4 families who used to get together and have dinner at each other's houses every week. So like for 1 week it would be one family shift. It was because they couldn't afford to heat their houses. They used to steal like railway sleepers to as wood as firewood, and steal coal off the slag heaps, which was illegal. You would get arrested for it. So I think it just goes to show that like while people do like to say, like, I get it, the mines, they were a business that were eventually going to finish, but I think they were finished so quickly, and not just quickly, just brutally. There was absolutely no regard for the human cost. I think.
Yeah.
I think I don't think it gets enough like credence really. There's just this kind of like, oh, people should have just got more jobs.
I think it's also strange to do that policy at the same time as reduce the top tax rate. The top tax rate went from 83% to then 60% for the first 2 terms of her premiership to 40%. And I think that it's very hard to reconcile the fact that all these people suddenly lost their jobs in these small, poor communities, yet the top tax rate went from 83% to 40%.
So the rich got richer.
The rich got richer and the poor got
shoved into the ground.
Yeah.
There's the poll tax as well. That was what eventually brought her down. That was like a flat rate?
Flat rate tax per capita, so just each person paid the same.
Which apparently she wasn't even signed up for the poll tax.
Really?
So, yeah, she wasn't even signed up for it at first, which I think is quite damning.
Yeah.
You were saying about Blair having good conditions. What about your guy, Harold Macmillan?
Well, yeah, if we want to talk about that. Earlier, Tom talked about the IMF bailout, which is what Thatcher inherited. But in every huge crisis that the UK's faced lately and previously, it's always compared to the biggest national crisis of Suez. They said the biggest national embarrassment is the Suez crisis, which is what Harold Macmillan inherited. Harold Macmillan inherited a broken Britain, didn't know its place in the world, its empire was almost crumbling, America had just chastised it in front of everyone. It had only just been recovering from a war. Britain was in an absolute state when Harold Macmillan inherited it. And he reconciled not just our reputation internationally, but our sense of identity. He helped us realize that we could be this bridging gap, which is still important in UK politics. We still see ourselves as outside of Europe, but also part of Europe. And we all still see ourselves as this big power that has this influence around the world. Like he reformed what the Commonwealth was to so many countries, and he reformed what Britain was in the world. So I think that that's why Macmillan's important. He inherited Suez, which is still this pinnacle of national embarrassment, and he left us with a much stronger and more certain of itself country and certain of its place in the world country.
I think you could say that about all our prime ministers, really. They all had a massive effect in increasing Britain's standing, and that might perhaps be why they're so popular. Like, even with Thatcher's domestic policies, it seems internationally she did increase our stock. That's one benefit of it. Tony Blair massively increased our stock. I think a transatlantic, he won the Congressional Medal, didn't he, for one? And he won the East-West Politician of the Decade in 2005. So he was a really respected figure abroad. Attlee was quite a good figure in that sense. I'd say one of Attlee's biggest weaknesses was his foreign policy, but
yeah,
his alignment with America was crucial in defining the world.
He very quickly identified when this whole third way idea was being. I think Attlee was very good at changing his policy when he needed to. So, like when he used to be a pacifist during Chamberlain, when Chamberlain was it the Chancellor? When he was calling for rearmament, very slow rearmament, but rearmament. Attlee was very vocal in his pacifism. He said, we don't need to do this. He was kind of going off the idea that Hitler said that I'm rearming, but no one else needs to. So, I mean, his argument was flawed. But as soon as...
the Germans never would have won the war anyway.
That's an argument for another time. But but yeah, as soon as Chamberlain started his policy of appeasement, Attlee was straight on the front foot saying, like, no, we need to oppose this man.
Well,
I think like he had a talent for it.
Didn't he?
Yeah, him and Churchill got on really well. They famously got on really well, and Attlee was very good at kind of dealing with the day-to-day, behind-the-scenes stuff.
I really think that's not brought up enough. Everyone, we spoke about Churchill, but everyone going, oh, Churchill won for Churchill. But Attlee was the one driving it from below almost.
Yeah, he was doing it like behind the scenes, wasn't he? Like Churchill was the face of it, and he kind of left Attlee to do. Attlee's respect for Churchill actually came from Gallipoli, ironically. I know we said that Gallipoli was a massive disaster, but Attlee served in that campaign, and he got pretty badly injured in it as well. And he said he thought that Churchill was actually quite a good military strategist, but he wasn't given the resources or something, and his ground assault wasn't very well implemented. But he had a lot of respect for Churchill, and that kind of shows later on when they're working together just how smoothly they got on running the government.
Yeah. Right. If you just have a one-word answer then from all you guys, who is the best post-war prime minister of all time? Start with you, Tom Mars.
What, a one-word answer?
Yeah. If you had to name one person.
Name and surname.
Macmillan.
Tom Hawkins.
He's died.
Macmillan. Okay, Joe Taylor.
Attlee.
I'll go with Attlee as well.
Ooh, two-way split.
Well, I think that. Are we done here?
That's actually 52% to us, 8% to you two.
Yeah.
So it's Macmillan, and that's the end of that.
Yeah.
Can I have a 6 million petition get absolutely thrown in the dirt?
Yeah.
You get 6 million signatures. If you can get 6 million signatures, we will do a second podcast.
All right.
I promise you that.
We'll debate this with our 16 followers. If we can get a few of them on board.
No, I want 6 million.
Well, I'm sure that'll happen. Well, anyway, thank you guys for taking part in this podcast. I think it's been pretty fruitful. Who knows who the greatest post-war prime minister is? I think they've all had a massive effect in our country and shaped the world today. So yeah, thank you, listener, for tuning into ARC, and see you next time.
I love you.